Welcome to Counseling Insights with Gerry Lamothe.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, how are you doing?
Terrific.
Excellent. So, what's our topic for today?
Well, I think we're going to have an interesting show today. We have a guest in the audience. I'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Stuart Nyman.
Hi, Stuart.
How are you? I just happened to wander through the front door and have a conversation. Next thing you know, I'm on radio talking about a subject matter that I dealt with for years and now really don't have much to do with.
Yeah, and that's one of the ironies of life, isn't it? Here, I just met you just a few minutes ago, and we were going to talk about the greater interest of society, and particularly as we have an increased awareness in the need for counseling and counseling services, and here you walk into the door. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, because I think the listeners would really appreciate the context of our conversation here.
I'm currently 43, going to be 44 years old. I was in college in the late 80s, decided that I wanted to become a physician primarily because I discovered psychopharmacology as an undergrad. And it was the only science that actually came naturally to me. So having gained an affinity for neuroscience, you had one of two different directions you go. You go medical chemistry at the time, or you could become a physician. So I knew that I wasn't going to be a medical chemist, so medicine seemed the route to go. So I was able to enter basically an honors pre-med program, which got me into medical school my junior year of undergrad. And the only reason why I was there was to practice psychiatry. Originally, I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but it was to practice mental health.
And you mentioned to me that your primary interest in mental health was to provide services or become involved in counseling services for children and adolescents. Is that right?
Absolutely. That was the one. That was one thing that was the combination of both neuroscience, psychopharm, and child and adolescent. Because for me, that is the time. I mean, there's no question that at any age, regardless whether it's gerontology or whatever, there's always a need for intervention and there's always a need for services. But the best time to have the greatest impact is when someone is just starting out, is when they're young. And if there is an issue, whether or not it's a diagnosis or just a behavioral issue or something, that if you can nab it at that time, that the potential for a positive outcome or an easier route is far better. So that's where my interest it was at the beginning of the issue as opposed to in the middle or at the end. Right.
And one of the exciting things, I think, for any one of us who are engaged in trying to provide services of counseling at any age and in any field of mental health is the fact that finally, as a community, we're talking more about providing those services and the opportunity and the availment of those services in many different ways throughout our school systems and throughout our communities and throughout our different economic impacts as well. And you had some pretty insightful thoughts on that.
This up in 5 minutes.
So we picked this all up in 5 minutes. It's really an incredible thing.
Yeah.
So you had some insightful thoughts about the manner and the way in which, at one point in our history not too long ago, a generation or so ago, that there were at least considerable services that were at least provided as an opportunity. And then all those services kind of dwindled. Do you want to expound on what we were sharing there?
I don't know necessarily that I'm qualified to give an accurate history, but I can give you what my own history is, which is that having been born in 1969 and grown up in the 70s, if I look back at my own issues, which is one thing that people have to say about mental health, is that you wind up working in it for one of two reasons. One, either because you had a genuine interest in it while studying, or two, you were working on your own issues.
I'm not sure that those two aren't always part of the mix.
Yeah, I know it was true for me because I look back at earliest stages of development, and then having worked in child and adolescent mental health, growing up in the 70s, there's really no question that I probably should have seen a child psychiatrist around 5 or 6 years old when I think a few obsessional qualities had developed. But for me specifically, it was my first introduction to mental health was as an adolescent. I'd gone through a crisis, which is how a lot of people actually wind up having an experience in mental health and receiving services. And I was 16 at the time, and that was my first introduction, and I actually spent some time at 16 as an inpatient in a fantastic facility. And I think what the best thing about it personally was that I was being treated for depression after having been mugged. And this was in Miami. And the staff that worked at this facility were so dedicated and so qualified. Some were earning their medical degrees, some were just in counseling, psychology. So my experience was so fantastic with it that was a good introduction on my own. But then I really never considered doing it for a living. I had no idea really what I was going to do as I went into school. And then, as I said before, having discovered neuroscience, which some schools are, focus more on counseling. Some, it kind of depends on where you wind up. Mine was very neuroscience oriented, and that's what got me going in that direction. So both when I was an adolescent in the 80s and then as late adolescent and young adult, there were facilities that existed that, we say facility now, and, I just saw someone's doing a retrospective of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest this weekend, which of course set certain aspects of mental health back 20 or 30 years. So I'm not talking about, Chattahoochee and our old institutions.
And the ones that had tremendous abuse going on, those existed as well. But in general, there was certainly a fair amount of services that were at least opportune or were availed at least to the community.
Absolutely. And people, I was explaining earlier that when I first left school, I took a deferment out of medical school, which was a very unpopular decision in my family. And so I was told that, I really had to make it on my own. And I very quickly learned that I really did have to make it on my own. They tell stay in school as long as possible. So
that's good advice.
Yeah, no, it is. Yes. Stay in school as long as possible, regardless of how old you are. But for me, I wound up knowing that I wanted to work in a particular child and adolescent psych facility that was called the Grant Center. And it had been built by Mr. and Mrs. Grant, or Dr. and Dr. Grant, literally from the foundation up in the 1970s. And when I was attending elementary school, middle school, high school in Miami, we knew of the Grant Center because some kids who had conduct issues spent some time out there. So it always had a positive reputation. And then I knew when I had come back, I was actually in school in Maryland. So I knew when I came back to South Florida of the places there were to work that the Grant Center had the best reputation. And so I had to wait for 3 months to get an interview. And then there was an entire process just to become a mental health tech at minimum wage. And realistically, if Grant were still open, and so now we're talking 20 years later, if Grant were still open, I would still be gladly working there as a mental health tech or as a team leader, or a variety of the positions that they did have, which I think mental health techs, or that position kind of still exists. But as far as the actual treatment programs, it's nothing like it was then. That's not being critical of the way it is now, because I certainly believe that people who are working in the helping professions are there for a reason. But the quality and quantity and availability of service for a variety of different reasons, whether it's financial or otherwise, really became an issue. And now, as you just mentioned, as we're hearing our own president say, things are hopefully going to come full circle.
Well, that's for me, having worked as a pastoral counselor dealing with families and with children, I've come to see particularly the economic downfall in the past decade, where people kind of put that issue far out of sight, and the opportunity and the availing of that, even through insurance companies, has been very, very difficult, to say the least, on people who need counseling and for families who need counseling. So it's been low in the priority even of our national discussion. And so that's one of the issues I think that's exciting for most people who work with mental health issues, that at least it's back on the agenda of discussion and how we can begin to provide more adequate services.
And to see where it goes from here is really, okay, because now we've said it. Okay, now it's part of the national discourse.
Correct.
Now we had this godforsaken tragedy.
In Connecticut.
In godforsaken tragedy in Connecticut, that's gotten a discussion going. Now I'll be curious to see where it goes from there, because the tendency, at least at the state level and the federal level, is to grab a mandate and come up with a great policy and throw a bunch of money at it. But it'll be very curious to see how that translates into actual services, because there is the opportunity to do some really, really, really good stuff if it's organized. I'm not saying the state needs to organize, or the federal government or whoever, but like-minded individuals wanting to provide quality services for people who need them. If you get the funding and the individuals right, you can really come up with something truly, truly positive.
And another exciting thing, particularly for me, is that as a pastoral counselor, I'm seeing a tremendous, not just a discussion, but a coming together, a kind of almost a round table effort, so to speak, to become holistic in our approach, to incorporate not just medical issues and psychological issues and social issues, but spiritual dimensions as well, and to be a lot more holistic in our approach to what it means to be a member of a family, to have a child become part of what is good, what is growth-filled, a child who's wanted, a child who's loved, and what the definitions of love are, and the behaviors of love are. Boy, that discussion is huge for me as a pastoral counselor.
No, definitely. It was something that in the hierarchy of what previously existed, whether what your position was in the hospital, obviously with the psychiatrist being on top, there was always the opportunity for spiritual development, spiritual counseling in the facility that I worked in, but that was primarily because of the individuals that worked there. It wasn't part of the treatment program. Now I see it as almost being essential, and unfortunately, people tend to get caught up in the definition of religion, or this religion versus that religion,
Correct.
And that's something that I'm afraid frightens some people away from a particular direction. When if you're just talking about spirituality and being attached to something greater in the universe than just what you're dealing with at that moment, that flows perfectly with mental health services, with mental health itself.
Correct, and that's certainly my approach in using the word love. It's not about a particular religious affiliation. The best of all religions really deal with the concept you've just described, is that we're attached somehow. We belong to something greater and bigger than ourselves. Children have that right to belong in a safe, wanted, in a sense, chosen environment, that they're wanted and that they belong. And when that is lacking, why, it's part of our human suffering. But when that's compounded with adults or parenting or behaviors from the adult world that don't even address that wounded issue in ourselves, then that wound just deepens and perpetuates and magnifies, as anybody in the mental health professions, unfortunately sees.
Speaking of, your own practice, is there a phone number that our listeners can reach you at?
Sure. They can reach me at area code 772-538-8297.
Okay, excellent.
I had to think there for a moment. I almost forgot my own number.
Well, this brings up an interesting topic, I think. But, I mean, how have you seen counseling and psychiatric care change, over the course of the years that you've been practicing?
Well, I have to say a funny story. When I first became involved directly, primarily as a counselor, and resigned active ministry and became focused more on mental health and counseling, it was predominantly psychiatrists and the professionals in the mental health community who would come and see me. This is a kind of a little community here in Vero Beach, and so there was a kind of a safety net in the kind of confidentiality that people saw in the ministry aspect. So it's kind of ironic that many of the professional mental health people locally actually first generated my practice here in Vero Beach.
That's
kind of unique.
That is definitely unique, because coming out of South Florida, which is the market in psychiatry down there was the hierarchical organization of hospitals to begin with is one thing, but then when I stopped working in in mental health. My last 2 years I spent doing psychiatric intake in an emergency room. And as I watched quality people, well-educated, regardless what the educational background was, but the degree of interest that they had and the amount of care that they had for what they were doing, as I saw those people becoming cynical, and I saw really gifted psychiatrists who were at the top of the hierarchy becoming cynical. And then years later, so I'm talking about the last 10 years, as you saw people almost taking pride in being cynics.
Mm-hmm.
It's, wow, this is really a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just specific to mental health, but, we were speaking spiritually. It's like, how do you take pride in being a cynic?
That's correct. Cynicism really, from my point of view, is a form of violence. It's a door that opens further, at least thought patterns that become violence. Violence is something that penetrates our humanity. So in that sense, when we become cynical in our relationships, I often try to help couples who become cynical with each other about their behaviors or their attitudes, that it really is the door opening for some kind of, at least a thought pattern that becomes or ushers in or allows in some kind of violence, some violation to the ethic of love.
And as the way I see some people approaching it, people that I know actually, is that they have evolved into cynics, as a result of life's experiences, as a result of being let down, as a result of frustration.
Betrayals and letdowns and so on.
It reminds me of there was a great line that one of my favorite comedians, George Carlin, had. He said, "Scratch a cynic and you'll find a disappointed idealist."
That's correct, Brian.
And
that's really true.
Whether Carlin said it or you said it, you're absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And so, you deal with issues in schools that are current as well, like bullying, and that's exactly what you find. It's the bully who needs not the most help necessarily, because the victim produces another victim because there's victimizing in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we come to peel those layers in our relationships of examining how hurtful behaviors become almost socialized or accepted by society, that we begin to see that there's a lot of layers there of hurt and woundedness that we really have to peel away from in our families, our relationships, and our personal lives.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about victimization, it's funny because I'm reminded the very first time that I saw the phrase cruel victimization written, and I was working in the hospital. I was on the adolescent facility, and we had about 30 kids, and someone was given at that time with timeouts. The term timeout has kind of evolved, and some people view it as kind of hokey. There in the inpatient setting, a timeout was basically in an open-door seclusion room. So you were, by no means locked up or tied up, but you were away from the community on the floor, hopefully thinking about what you were doing. When I had read in report why the young man was there for 2 hours, the person who worked 7 to 3, I worked 3 to 11, had written cruel victimization. And I hadn't actually viewed that as a descriptor of a behavior before until that time. And it's been something that has been recurrent when I see things societal, since I don't work in mental health anymore. When you see that the cruel victimization is something, just as a person, I guess for the most part I'm a humanitarian, but that's something that I find particularly distasteful is someone who goes out of their way to create difficulty of any type, no matter how serious or how minor it may be. That's something that I find particularly distasteful. And that was probably my one prejudice in working with kids in the hospital, was that I did have a difficult time with kids who are unusual.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, who was unusual.
I would argue that, the whole process of growing up, learning to find one's way in the world is like socializing a lot of those sort of inherent instincts that children have, one of which, may be the capacity for cruelty.
Yeah.
Well, that's absolutely true. And cruelty and prejudice kind of go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
We know that our prejudice against many things, different kinds of situations, we become prejudicial in our gender or sexuality or in our ethics in many ways, that's exactly part and parcel of how prejudice kind of takes hold generationally often. So.
And I always heard, I think at least explained, or I've heard it said, I may have said it myself, not originally, I'm sure, but, that prejudice, arises from ignorance. And again, there's lots of interesting sayings, but when you actually think about them, what they actually mean, even before I reference cruel victimization and what it actually represented, and in prejudice, whatever it is coming out of either naivety or a lack of understanding, when you give these things real thought, actually sitting back in your spiritual mind or in your quiet time, whatever it is, and you give some of these things real thought, I don't know how people in general see their own behavior and how they do engage in, whether, again, cynicism, any of these things, how they can sit back and not see how they engage in some of these behaviors. That's one thing that I've always, people refer to it as self-deluded. I never necessarily believed in that. It was just people unwilling to take a look because, at the end of the day, you are the one who knows, you know every thought that you've had during the course of the day. You know what your behavior was. You know your positive interactions, negative interactions.
Yeah, and that kind of self-awareness is a whole field of study that's burgeoning and mushrooming at this point. How much a true awareness do we have? And while there are many models of doing that, we're constantly growing in our self-awareness. So,
once again, if you could give our listeners the phone number to reach you at your practice.
Sure, and I'd be glad to hear from anybody at 538-8297. It's 538-8297.
Well, thank you for being with us here, Gerry, and we'll see you next week.
Well, I appreciate it, and thank you very much for coming on in.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. This was a pleasant experience, very much so, and accidental, spiritual.
Take care, Brian. Take care, Brian. Take care, Brian. Research tells us that in many, many ways, even physical isolation like that is in itself not the problem. There are people, it's the choice or the lack of choice in isolating ourselves. Monks, for example, who choose isolation for a greater purpose are actually more connected. I think of a great monk, Thomas Merton, who lived in the 20th century, in the middle of last century. What a wonderful connection he had. He was a cloistered monk, and yet had been given permission to communicate with all the leaders of the world. And from his unique little monastic life, he influenced great thinkers throughout the world. So that's not the case with most people, however, as in the case that you're mentioning. Most people don't choose that form of isolation. They do it out of fear. And so this is the job that we all have in the mental health community, the professionals, but more importantly, just neighbors. We're all people. And though mental health counselors are needed, it's the love and the caring of one another that really changes the nature of this world. And so care for her. Reach out to your neighbors. Understand that people have difficult emotional and mental problems that sometimes we just don't see or understand.
The whole pay it forward can really work.
Pay it forward concept.
Yeah.
Understand that somehow or another people are blinded or stuck in their development, that they've had tragedy that sometimes they don't even understand, let alone want to share. And so the more that we treat others with kindness, with caring, with respect in our circumstances around life, well, the less like a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old we're actually acting.
Well, that's a very good point. So everyone out there, reach out and be kind to someone who might be feeling lonely today or tomorrow. Gerry, give us your contact information one more time for our listeners.
Certainly, 538-8297.
Okay, and that's area code 772.
538-8297.
Very good. Thank you so much. You've been listening to Counseling Insights with your host, Gerry Lamothe. Stick with us. We'll be right back.